The mist at the border of the Shadow Realm didn't just drift. It crawled like a living thing, clinging to the hem of Nyx Sterling's tattered silk gown. The iron shackles around her wrists were ice-cold, a physical manifestation of the betrayal that burned in her chest. Ahead, the gates of the Black Citadel loomed like the teeth of a predator, and behind her stood the man who had sold her for a truce. "Please, father," Nyx whispered, her voice fracturing against the silence of the waste. "Don't leave me here. Not with him." Lord Sterling didn't look back. He wouldn't meet the eyes of the daughter he had packaged like a head of cattle. Instead, he bowed low as a massive, dark silhouette emerged from the fog. Prince Jaxen Mordrake, the alpha of the Iron Court, stepped forward, his presence so heavy it seemed to still the very wind. His eyes, sharp and predatory, locked onto Nyx, tracing the tear tracks on her pale cheeks. Terror, cold and paralyzing, seized her heart. She had heard the stories of the prince's cruelty, of the souls he had broken. As his gloved hand reached for her chain, Nyx felt the world tilt. She was no longer a lady of the light. She was the plaything of a monster. The heavy rattle of the iron chain was the only sound that pierced the oppressive silence of the borderlands. Every link that slid through Prince Jaxen Mordrake's gloved hand felt like a strike against Nyx's soul. She stumbled, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that turned to silver mist in the frigid air. Behind her, the carriage bearing the Sterling crest, the golden sun she had once called her own, was already turning away. The wheels crunched over the frost-cracked earth, a rhythmic retreat that signaled the end of her life as she knew it. "Look at me, Nyx." The prince's voice wasn't the roar of a beast she had expected. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to hum beneath her skin, steady and terrifyingly calm.
She refused.
She kept her gaze pinned to the mud-stained hem of her gown, her body trembling so violently that the shackles chimed like funeral bells. To look at him was to acknowledge her reality. She was the collateral in a failed rebellion, a peace offering thrown to a wolf to keep him from the gates of her father's estate. She remembered her father's last words, whispered not with love, but with a desperate, sweating fear. "It is a small price for our survival, daughter. Try not to provoke him." A large, leather-clad hand reached out. Nyx flinched, pulling back so sharply she nearly fell, but Jaxen's grip was like an iron vice around her upper arm. He didn't shake her. He simply held her upright, anchoring her to the spot. The heat radiating from his body was an affront to the biting cold of the Shadow Realm. "The Sterling coward has fled," Jaxen remarked, his eyes tracking the disappearing carriage with a flicker of unmistakable disdain. He turned back to Nyx, his features sharp and angular, carved from the same dark stone as the mountains surrounding them. He traded a diamond for a few more days of gutterrot peace. "I wonder, little bird, do you know why I accepted his offer?" Nyx finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a broken reed. "Because you want to break me. To show them what happens to those who defy the Iron Court." A shadow of something, not a smile, but a grim tightening of his jaw, crossed the prince's face. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could smell wood smoke and rain on him, a scent so grounded it felt out of place in this nightmare. "I have enough broken things in my kingdom, Nyx Sterling. I have no use for another." With a sudden, violent jerk, he snapped the lead chain from her wrists. He didn't unlock the shackles, but he freed her from his tether. "Walk," he commanded, gesturing toward the yawning black maw of the fortress gates. "The mist is rising, and the things that live within it do not care for royal titles or tragic stories." Nyx looked back one last time. The Sterling carriage was gone. The horizon was a flat, gray line of abandonment. With no choice but the dark, she took her first step into the Shadow Realm, the Alpha Prince walking silently behind her like a predator guarding its kill. The iron gates of the Black Citadel closed with a finality that echoed like a guillotine blade. Inside, the world was a labyrinth of obsidian stone and flickering blue torches that cast long, distorted shadows against the damp walls. Nyx walked with her head bowed, her breath hitching every time a distant howl or the scrape of metal on stone reached her ears. Every step she took into the heart of the Shadow Realm felt like descending into a tomb. Jaxen walked several paces behind her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't speak, but his presence was a constant weight at her back, a reminder that there was no escape. They moved through hollowed-out corridors where the air grew thick with the smell of iron and ancient dust. Occasionally, dark shapes moved in the periphery, guards in spiked armor who stood like statues, their eyes glowing faintly behind their visors as the prince passed. Each time, Nyx felt their predatory gaze linger on her, the sacrifice, brought to satisfy their master's whims. "Where are you taking me?" Nyx finally whispered, the silence becoming more unbearable than the fear itself. "Is it the oubliette? Or the towers where the screams come from?" "You listen to too many tavern tales, Nyx," Jaxen replied, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "The screams in this castle usually belong to those who try to take what wasn't theirs. Unless you plan on stealing from me, your tongue is safe." He stopped abruptly before a massive door carved with the likeness of a snarling wolf. With a push, the door swung open, revealing not a damp cell, but a suite of rooms that felt aggressively cold and grand. High windows looked out onto the jagged mountain peaks, and a fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in. On a heavy oak table sat a tray of dark bread, roasted meats, and a flagon of wine. "Eat," Jaxen commanded, pointing to the table. "You look as though a stiff breeze would shatter you, and I have no interest in a guest who dies of starvation on her first night." "A guest?" Nyx turned, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I was sold to you in chains. I am a prisoner, not a guest." Jaxen stepped into the room, his shadow stretching across the floor until it touched the tips of her boots. He reached out, his fingers brushing the iron cuffs still encircling her wrists. For a moment, his touch was almost gentle, the heat of his skin searing through her terror. Then, with a flash of silver in his hand, he produced a key. The locks clicked open, and the heavy iron fell to the rug with a dull thud. "Your father sold you to save his own skin," Jaxen said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly low. "But in my kingdom, we do not trade in flesh. You are here because I chose to let him believe he had a choice. Rest now, Nyx Sterling. Tomorrow, the fear truly begins." He turned and vanished into the hall, the door locking behind him. Nyx collapsed onto the edge of the bed, her wrists feeling strangely light and vulnerable without the chains. She stared at the fire, the orange flames dancing in her eyes, wondering if the prince's mercy was simply a different, more sophisticated kind of cruelty. The morning in the Shadow Realm did not bring sunlight. It brought a bruised, violet haze that bled through the high, arched windows of Nyx's chamber. She hadn't slept. Every groan of the castle's settling stones sounded like a footstep, and every flicker of the dying fire looked like a reaching hand. When the heavy oak door finally groaned open, Nyx bolted upright, her fingers clutching the velvet coverlet as if it were armor. It wasn't the prince. A small, wiry figure slipped inside, dragging a heavy toolbox that clattered against the stone. The boy looked no older than 19, with grease-stained fingers and a lopsided grin that seemed entirely too bright for a fortress of doom. "Morning, sunshine," the boy chirped, eyeing the untouched tray of food.
"I'm Piplaweri."
"The prince said you'd probably be shaking like a leaf in a gale, so he sent me to check the heater. These old pipes scream louder than the prisoners sometimes." Nyx blinked, her voice dry. "The prince sent you? Jaxen?"
"Yeah."
"He's got a temper like a lightning storm, but he hates a draft," Pip said, kneeling by the hearth and immediately tinkering with the brass valve. "Don't look so spooked. If he wanted you dead, you have been wolf bait at the border. He's got a funny way of showing it, but you're probably the safest person in this god's-forsaken rock right now." Before Nyx could wrap her head around the idea of a considerate monster, the air in the room shifted. The temperature didn't drop, but the pressure rose, a heavy, magnetic pull that signaled Jaxen's arrival. He stood in the doorway, stripped of his heavy traveling cloak. In a simple black tunic, his physical presence was even more daunting, shoulders broad enough to block out the light, and arms corded with the scars of 100 skirmishes. "Out, Pip," Jaxen commanded. Pip didn't even flinch. He just tossed a thumb at the prince. "Vents are clear, boss. Try not to growl at her too much. She's already halfway to a faint." He winked at Nyx and vanished into the hall before Jaxen could respond. The Alpha Prince stepped into the room, his boots clicking rhythmically on the stone. He stopped at the table and picked up a small, leather-bound book that Nyx hadn't noticed before. He held it out to her. "My father's laws," Jaxen said, his voice a low rumble. "In the Sterling lands, you were taught that power is inherited through blood and maintained through lies. Here, power is earned through endurance. You think I am a monster because your father needed a villain to justify his cowardice." Nyx stood, her legs trembling but her chin lifted in a spark of her old defiance. "I saw the shackles, Prince Jaxen. I felt the cold iron. That wasn't a story." Jaxen took a step closer, invading her space until she was forced to look up, her throat tight. He reached out, not for her neck, but for the book in her hand, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. The contact sent a jolt through her that wasn't entirely fear. It was a strange, terrifying electricity. "The shackles were for your father's benefit," Jaxen whispered, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "He needed to believe he was giving me a slave. He didn't realize he was giving me his replacement.
Come.
There is someone you need to see, and a lie you need to unlearn." He turned on his heel, expecting her to follow. As Nyx stepped into the corridor, she realized the prince wasn't leading her to a dungeon, but toward the Great Hall, where the true hierarchy of the Shadow Realm was about to be revealed. The Great Hall of the Black Citadel was not the grisly trophy room Nyx had imagined. Instead of skulls and spoils of war, the vast chamber was lined with towering shelves of brass-bound ledgers and humming machinery that Pip Lowry seemed to be overseeing with frantic energy. Steam hissed from bronze pipes embedded in the obsidian walls, and the scent of ozone, the smell of lightning captured in a bottle, stung the back of Nyx's throat. "You expected a blood-stained throne, didn't you?" Jaxen asked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the map spread across a massive iron table at the center of the room. The map was bioluminescent, glowing with blue ley lines that pulsed like a heartbeat. Nyx hugged her arms across her chest. "My father told me you sacrificed the weak to the mountain spirits to keep your power. He said the Shadow Realm was a graveyard." Jaxen let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. "Your father's weak are the people who built this city. The spirits are the thermal vents we harness to keep our children from freezing while the Sterling lands burned through their forests for vanity fires." He gestured to the maps. "Look closer, Nyx. These lines aren't borders. They're power grids. My people don't serve me because they fear my teeth. They serve me because I am the only thing standing between them and the winter that never ends." Nyx stepped forward, her curiosity momentarily eclipsing her terror. The map showed the Sterling lands, her home, bleeding gray and cold, their resources dwindling while the terrifying Shadow Realm thrived in a controlled, mechanical heat. "If you're so prosperous," she whispered, "why let them think you're a monster? Why take me in chains?" Jaxen finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Because a monster is a shield. If the world thinks I am a beast, they stay away from my borders. They leave my people in peace. And as for the chains..." He paused, his gaze dropping to her pale wrists where the red marks of the iron were already fading. "I needed to see if you were like them. If you would beg, or if you would bite." "And?" Nyx challenged, her pulse quickening. "You didn't beg," Jaxen said, taking a slow step toward her. The air between them grew thick, charged with that same magnetic pressure from the morning. "But you are still terrified. You look at me and see the alpha who will break you. You haven't realized yet that I am the only one in this world who has no intention of using you." Before she could respond, the heavy doors at the far end of the hall burst open. Commander Vane marched in, his silver armor clashing against the dark aesthetic of the room. His face was a mask of cold fury, his hand resting on the hilt of a jagged broadsword. "My prince," Vane barked, his eyes flickering toward Nyx with a look of pure loathing. "The Sterling scouts are at the perimeter. They didn't just sell her. They're using her presence here as a rescue pretext to scout our defenses. Your mercy is bringing a war to our doorstep." Nyx felt the blood drain from her face. Her father hadn't just sold her. He had used her as a Trojan horse. She looked at Jaxen, expecting to see the monster finally emerge, but the Alpha Prince merely tightened his grip on the edge of the iron table, his knuckles turning white. "Let them come," Jaxen growled, his eyes locking onto Nyx's with a fierce, protective intensity. "They gave her up. They don't get her back." The atmosphere inside the Black Citadel shifted from a cold tension to a thundering roar of preparation. From the high windows, Nyx could see the horizon flickering with the orange glow of torches. Her father's army, the Sun Guard, had arrived, but they didn't come with the fanfare of a rescue. They came with siege engines. "They aren't here for me," Nyx whispered, her voice trembling as she watched the distant movement. "They're here for the heat, for the brass and the lightning." Commander Vane stepped closer to her, his shadow looming large. "Finally, the girl shows a spark of intelligence," he spat, his voice like grinding gravel. "Your father played a masterstroke, little lamb. He gave Jaxen a gift that violated the ancient treaties, giving him the legal right to invade under the guise of retrieving a kidnapped daughter. You are the match that's going to burn this city to ash." Jaxen moved with a speed that defied his massive frame. In a heartbeat, he was between Nyx and the general, his hand clamped firmly on Vane's shoulder. "That is enough, Vane. She is not a match. She is a citizen of the Iron Court now. She is a Sterling," Vane roared. "Her blood is the very thing we've fought for generations. My prince, give her back. Throw her from the ramparts if you must, but do not let our people die for a girl who is born to hate us." Jaxen's eyes glowed with a feral, amber light, the true mark of the Alpha. "I do not throw away what is mine. Go to the battlements. Prepare the static coils. If a single Sterling soldier crosses the mist line, show them why the shadows are to be feared." Vane gave a stiff, resentful bow and stormed out, his cloak snapping like a whip. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of Pip's machines. Nyx looked up at Jaxen, her heart hammering. The terror she had felt at the border was still there, but it was changing. It was no longer the fear of a victim facing a predator. It was the fear of a woman realizing her entire world was a lie, and the only person standing in the wreckage was the man she had been taught to despise. "He's right," Nyx said, her voice stronger than before. "If you keep me, you lose your peace. If you give me back, you save your people. Why would you risk everything for someone who is sold to you?" Jaxen reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his fingers finally brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was no longer iron cold, it was searing. "Because I saw your face when your father turned his back," he said softly. "I saw a girl who realized her home was a cage, and her family were the jailers. You think I saved you because I'm a hero? No, NYX. I saved you because I know what it's like to be the monster everyone uses until they don't need a shield anymore." He walked to a hidden compartment in the wall and pulled out a small, silver-handled dagger. He pressed it into her palm. "The Sterling army will be at the gates by dawn. They will call for you. They will tell you they've come to save you. But look at the iron in your hand and remember who truly put the chains on your wrists." Nyx gripped the dagger, the cold metal grounding her. For the first time, she didn't look at the door to escape. She looked at the prince and saw the man behind the myth. The ground beneath the Black Citadel groaned as the Sterling siege engines thundered in the distance. Giant harpoons, trailing thick hempen ropes, hissed through the freezing air, clawing at the obsidian battlements. Above the roar of the wind, the voice of Nyx's father boomed through a magically amplified horn, sounding like the righteous tolling of a bell. "Jaxen Mordrake, release my daughter and surrender the secrets of your fires, or we will tear your fortress stone from stone." Lord Sterling's voice was devoid of the tremor Nyx remembered. He sounded emboldened, a man who had finally found the excuse he needed to plunder. Nyx stood on the high ramparts, shielded from the biting wind by Jaxen's own fur-lined cloak. The Alpha Prince stood beside her, a silhouette of grim defiance. Below them, the Shadow Realm's defense was unlike anything the Sterling army had ever seen. There were no archers, only men and women standing behind Pip Lowry's massive brass coils, which hummed with a low, bone-deep vibration. "They think we are primitive," Jaxen muttered, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "They think we survive on luck and cruelty. They have no idea that we survived because we had to be smarter than the sun." A messenger arrived, panting and covered in soot. "My prince, Commander Vane, is demanding we hand the girl over. He says the Sterling Vanguard is targeting the thermal stabilizers. If they hit the main line, the city will freeze before the sun sets." Jaxen didn't hesitate. He turned to Nyx, his amber eyes searching hers. The terrifying Alpha was gone, replaced by a leader weighing the lives of thousands against the life of one. "Nyx, if you go to the gates now, I can call a ceasefire. I can negotiate. You would be back in the light of your father's court. You would be safe from the shadow." Nyx looked at the dagger he had given her, then out at the army led by the man who had traded her away. She saw her father's banners, the golden sun, and realized it offered no warmth, only the blinding glare of a liar. Then she looked at Jaxen's people below, huddling near the humming coils, trusting their prince to keep the dark at bay. "My father doesn't want me, Jaxen," Nyx said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "He wants the power you built. If I go back, I'm just a trophy. If you stay here, you are a target," Jaxen finished. "Then let me be a target that bites back," Nyx replied. She turned to the messenger. "Tell Commander Vane that Nyx Sterling died at the border. I am a daughter of the Iron Court now. And tell Pip Lowry to overcharge the coils. If they want the fire of the Shadow Realm, give it to them." Jaxen's jaw tightened, a flash of pride, and something deeper, more visceral, flickering in his gaze. He stepped forward, his hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her forehead to his in a gesture of raw, alpha bonding. "Then let the world see what happens when the shadow fights back," he growled. He turned to his men, his voice rising to a deafening roar. "Fire the coils. Protect your queen." The word queen sent a shockwave through Nyx, but there was no time for fear. As the first bolt of blue lightning arced from the citadel toward the Sterling ranks, the battle for the Shadow Realm truly began. The sky above the Black Citadel exploded into a chaotic symphony of blue lightning and orange fire. The static coils hummed a deafening, high-pitched note before unleashing arcs of pure energy that shattered the Sterling harpoons midair. But the sheer numbers of the Sun Guard were overwhelming. Under the cover of the smoke, a specialized unit led by Lord Sterling himself had breached the lower ventilation shafts, the very veins of the city Pip had worked so hard to maintain. Nyx was swept into the chaos of the inner sanctum. The smell of ozone and burning iron filled the air. She found herself separated from Jaxen as the sound of clashing steel echoed through the corridors. In the heart of the Great Hall, near the glowing map of the realm, she saw him, her father. Lord Sterling looked out of place in his pristine white armor, his face twisted in a mask of greed as he gestured for his men to dismantle the brass machinery. "Nyx," he shouted, spotting her. He didn't rush to embrace her. He pointed his sword at her chest. "Tell your beast to stand his men down, and I might let you live in the servants' quarters. You've done your job well, drawing him out, making him weak with his obsession for you." "I was never his obsession, father," Nyx said, her voice echoing with a coldness she didn't know she possessed. She gripped the silver-handled dagger. "I was his choice. You only saw a commodity. He saw a person." Enough of this sentimentality. Sterling lunged forward, but a shadow moved faster. Jaxen dropped from the upper mezzanine, his heavy blade meeting Sterling's with a force that sent sparks flying onto the maps. The Alpha Prince was a whirlwind of dark fury, his eyes glowing with an intense, predatory amber. He fought with a brutal efficiency, pushing Sterling back toward the humming thermal core. "You dare to enter my home," Jaxen growled, his voice a low vibration that shook the floorboards. You dared to use her as a lure. She is mine to use, Sterling screamed, desperate and sweating. He signaled to a hidden archer in the shadows. Nyx saw the glint of the arrowhead aiming for Jaxen's throat. Without thinking, she didn't scream. She acted. Using the agility she had learned navigating the Citadel's narrow pipes with Pip, she threw her dagger. The blade whistled through the air, burying itself in the archer's shoulder just as the arrow flew wide, shattering a glass pressure gauge instead. The gauge hissed, releasing a cloud of scalding steam that blinded the Sterling soldiers. In the confusion, Jaxen disarmed Lord Sterling with a savage twist of his wrist. He didn't kill him. Instead, he forced the older man to his knees, his massive hand gripping Sterling's neck, forcing him to look at Nyx. "Look at her," Jaxen commanded. "The girl you sold. She just saved the man you fear. You didn't just lose a daughter today, Sterling. You lost the only mercy you had left." The battle around them began to falter as the Sun Guard realized their leader was captured. The monster had not been defeated. He had simply been awakened. The great hall fell into a haunting silence, broken only by the dying hiss of the steam pipes and the heavy, ragged breathing of the defeated. Lord Sterling lay broken at Jaxen's feet, his pristine white armor charred and smeared with the soot of a kingdom he had tried to colonize. The Sterling soldiers, seeing their lord captured and the terrifying efficiency of the Shadow Realm's technology, dropped their weapons in a clattering chorus of surrender. Jaxen didn't move. He stood like a statue of obsidian, his gaze fixed on Nyx. The adrenaline of the fight still pulsed through him, his alpha aura so thick it felt like a physical weight in the room. But as his eyes met hers, the predatory glow began to soften. He looked at the empty space in her hand where the dagger had been, the weapon she had used to save his life. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice cracking the silence. He ignored the cowering Lord Sterling and stepped toward her, his movements stripped of their martial aggression. Nyx looked down at her arm, where a stray splinter of glass had sliced her skin. She barely felt the pain. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a girl made of porcelain, waiting to be shattered or sold. She felt like the iron that reinforced the walls of the Citadel. "It's nothing," she said, her voice sounding deeper, grounded by a newfound authority. "The city, is it safe?" Pip Lowry emerged from behind a heavy brass console, his face covered in oil, but his eyes bright with triumph. "The thermal core is holding Nyx. We've diverted the overcharge. The Shadow Realm stays warm for another winter." He looked at her with a new kind of respect, not as a guest, but as a comrade. Commander Vane entered the hall, his sword drawn and ready to execute the prisoners, but he stopped when he saw Nyx standing side by side with Jaxen. He looked at Lord Sterling with disgust, then at Nyx. For a long moment, the general who had called her a match to burn the city remained silent. Slowly, deliberately, he sheathed his blade and bowed his head to her. It was a silent acknowledgement. She was no longer a Sterling. She was one of them. Jaxen reached out, taking her hand. He didn't pull her toward him. He simply held it, his thumb tracing the line of her palm. "They came to reclaim you," he whispered, loud enough for the trembling Lord Sterling to hear. "They told the world you were a victim of the beast." Nyx turned to her father, who looked up at her with pleading, pathetic eyes, the eyes of a man who still thought he could manipulate his way out of a grave. "I am not a victim," Nyx said, and the words felt like a crown being placed upon her head. "And he is not a beast. You brought war to our gates, father. Now, you will stay to see the world we build without you." She didn't look back as Jaxen led her toward the high balcony. As they stepped out, the people of the Shadow Realm, the mechanics, the healers, the weary soldiers looked up. A roar of cheers began to build, a sound more powerful than any siege engine. Nyx Sterling was gone. In her place stood the Iron Queen, the woman who had looked into the heart of the shadow and found her home. The dawn that broke over the Shadow Realm was unlike any Nyx had ever seen. The violet haze of the mountains was pierced by a steady, golden light, not from the sun, but from the glowing conduits of the Citadel, now running at full capacity. The war was over, but the reckoning had just begun. In the center of the courtyard, The remnants of the Sterling army were gathered, disarmed and humbled. Lord Sterling stood in the center, stripped of his titles and his armor, looking small and fragile against the towering obsidian walls. Jaxen stood on the dais, his hand resting firmly on the small of Nyx's back, a silent testament to their united front. "You came here seeking to rescue a daughter you had already discarded," Jaxen's voice boomed, carrying to every corner of the fortress. "You sought to steal the warmth of a people you called monsters. By the laws of the Iron Court, your life is forfeit." Lord Sterling fell to his knees, his voice cracking. "Nyx, please. Blood for blood. You cannot let him do this." Nyx stepped forward, the wind whipping her dark hair around her face. She looked at the man who had raised her, realizing that the fear he had instilled in her for years was nothing more than a shadow cast by a weak man. She looked at Jaxen, whose amber eyes were waiting for her signal. The Alpha Prince had given her the ultimate power, the right to decide the fate of her enemy. "Execution is too quick for a man who fears the cold so much," Nyx said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Exile him. Send him back to his dying lands without a single spark of the fire he tried to steal. Let him rule over the ashes of the home he was willing to burn." The crowd erupted in a somber, respectful cheer. Commander Vane stepped forward, signaling his guards to haul the former lord away. As Sterling was dragged toward the gates, the same gates where he had once abandoned his daughter, he realized the true weight of his loss. He wasn't just losing a war, he was losing the future. With the threat gone, the atmosphere of the Citadel transformed. Pip Lowry was already organizing the repair crews, his laughter echoing as he tossed a wrench to a fellow mechanic. The bridge between the monsters and the light had finally been built, and it was made of the very iron and courage Nyx had found within herself. Jaxen turned Nyx to face him. The morning light caught the scars on his face, softening the harsh lines of his brow. He didn't speak with the roar of an alpha, but with the tenderness of a man who had finally found his anchor. "You saved me in more ways than one, Nyx Sterling," he whispered. "I'm not a Sterling anymore," she reminded him, a small, genuine smile tugging at her lips. "No," Jaxen agreed, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing over the skin where the terror had once lived. "You are the heartbeat of the Shadow Realm. And as long as I breathe, you will never have to walk in the dark alone again." Under the watchful eyes of their people, the Alpha Prince leaned down and sealed their victory with a kiss, a promise of a reign built not on fear, but on a love that had survived the frost. The girl who was once terrified of the wolf had become the one who led the pack.